All right, well, today we are back to work on the C6 competition drift car build. This thing is coming along nicely. It's coming together better than I ever could have hoped, man. This thing it's really a dream build for me, and I'm really happy with how it's turning out. We've got a lot of work left to do, but we've got a lot of big stuff out of the way. The drivetrain is fully in and mounted. Our front trans setup is done. Our clutch is in. Trans tunnel's made. All of that stuff is sorted out. That's a huge thing. And last episode, we knocked out the single biggest project, which is building our turbo headers. Now, I'd never built a set of headers. You know, I was confident I could figure it out, but there was a lot that needed to be taken into consideration. You know, we debated between single turbo, twin turbo, where we wanted the turbo, where we wanted the downpipe, and tried to lay out every possible thing that's going to need to go in here so we didn't build it in a way that would make one thing or the other very difficult to deal with. So we finally figured out the plan. Then it was time to build the headers. Now the headers, you know, there's a lot of things to check off the checklist, right? So we got to be able to get them in and out without some major struggle. We don't want to have to jack the engine up or something to take one of them out. That's a no-go. We also needed to be able to get the spark plugs in and out easily. This being a turbo motor, it's something we need to service pretty regularly. So if we got to take the header off to pull the plug out, that's just going to add so much time on the back end of maintaining this car. So that was a big thing to consider. And our plug wires. We wanted to make sure that no plug wire was going to have to sit against the runner, because no matter what you do to sleeve a plug wire, if it sits on the exhaust, it's going to burn. And I'm not trying to replace plug wires every single event and deal with a random misfire popping up, so that was really important. And then not to mention, outside of all of that, we had to make them fit in the bay and point in the direction they needed to where we could get them into the turbo. So there was a lot to consider to try to get them into this merge that we've got here. So that's what's next. We need to build to the turbo itself. So we've got our merge, we got our V-band for here, we got our downpipe V-band, we've got our outlet V-band for here, for the intercooler. We've got our 2.5-inch V-bands for the collectors on the headers. So that way this pipe to the turbo will be disconnectable. And we've got a bunch of Mishimoto 2.5-inch J-bends to build it out of. So that's what we need to start working on. So we need to get the turbo exactly where we want it. We've mocked it up roughly where we want it, but we need to get it in its exact location or thereabouts before we start doing this. And we're not even exactly sure what that's going to be. It's going to kind of depend on this. So this side's going to be harder because this is going to have a much shorter run to the turbo, since the turbo is going to be right about here. So this is kind of what we're going to have to focus on, is where we need to put it, where we need to orient it to where we can get a nice run into it from here, because from here we have tons of room to get everything lined up. The further away from something you are, generally the easier it is to get everything lined up, because you have more distance to, you know, make some little jogs, some lefts, some rights. Now I'm going to try to avoid using pie cuts. If you watch the fab work regularly on this channel, you know I do like pie cuts. And the reason for that is you can get really precise fit up. Like for the downpipe, trying to snake through here, we're probably going to have to use pie cuts. But for this, for the hot side, we want to minimize the welds. The less welds, the less failure points. So it's a tall order, but let's see what we can do. Let's quit jibber jabbering, get into it. So the first thing I wanted to do was go ahead and get this merge welded to the V-band so we could bolt it to the turbo and have that just fixed in place while we're mocking everything up. So what I did was I went ahead and pulled the exhaust housing off so that way we could use it as essentially a big heat sink when we weld this V-band to this merge. It's really easy to warp a V-band. You've got to put a decent bit of heat into it when you're welding it, and if you don't have something to suck that heat out and keep it squished flat and true, it's real easy to warp them. And this is definitely not one we want to be warped, because if it leaks, we're going to be leaking exhaust gas that could be going to the turbo, and that's going to lead to the turbo not spooling quickly. So we tried a few different methods with back purging this. I tried to just shove tinfoil in there, but it was just eating gas, and we were very low on gas, and the gas store did not have a 125 argon, which we needed, so we were trying to make do. We were trying to minimize the gas loss. You have to have some gas coming out while you're back purging, but we were trying to minimize it. So we got a setup that worked, put some tin foil, clamped it in between the V-bands, welded it out, no warpage. That was the goal, no warpage. Now this is done. We can put the exhaust housing back on the turbo and clamp the merge to the turbo so we have all of that in place when we go to mock up our hot side. Now another thing we need to do is get our V-bands on our headers, because that's another thing that's going to be in place and take up distance. It's going to affect how we build the hot side. And not only that, but we're going to be building from one side of the V-band to the turbo. So I wanted to get those tacked on and mocked up, get the headers back in, and we could start figuring this out. All right, it's time to see if we can get this side back in now that it's got a V-band on it. It was tight before, and I think maybe with the dry sump lines it'll be really tight. Now, the way it's built, we can easily get it out if we just pulled the alternator bracket off. I'd like to avoid that, but also not taking the headers off all that often. So, you know. So we started trying with all our might to get this header in without taking the alternator off. Now, for this one time, obviously, it would be quicker to just take the alternator off, get it back in, and continue down our path. But I want to see if there's a way, because if we figure out a way, that'd be great for the future. If we don't figure out a way, then we know for the future. So I wanted to try every combination before we resorted to taking the alternator off, but unfortunately we had to. Now luckily this ICT billet bracket setup, the whole bracket comes off with 3 bolts. Now the 3 bolts are a little tricky to get to, but not a huge deal. With that off, header slips in, no problem. Even with the V-band flange on there, piece of cake, we get that bolted back up. And then we can go ahead and toss the alternator back in. Again, a little bit of a tricky procedure. There's some spacers behind and the Allen bolts, but we got it done, we got it in, headers back in, alternator reinstalled. All right, well, that was definitely a bit of a process, but not too bad. It would have been really easy if I didn't lose my 1/4 inch 6mm Allen socket, because I can easily get in there with the ratchet, but I lost it. When I was doing this, still haven't found it yet. It's the only one I'm missing out of all of these. Only one. I never lose tools. Makes me so sad. Hate losing tools. Anyway, I'm gonna throw this other side on, and then we're gonna get the turbo in here somewhere, start mocking that up. Get ready to try to go from A to B. So we tossed the turbo back in where we had planned to put it, and we bounced around a ton of ideas on where to put this thing. We tried it every which way. I had a plan originally when I decided to rebuild the turbo kit, then that changed. We thought this was the ideal spot, but putting it in here, man, that merge, the height of that, it makes it really tricky to get from the tall header down into the turbo. There's just not a lot of room to make the run. It's a very short distance. So Josue came up with the idea of maybe flipping it. We tried to zip tie it into place. It's really tricky to hold a big turbo like this and mock this stuff up. All right, well, we were looking at it upside down, which I'll show you in a second, which is my original plan. That's why I built this header high. That header had to go low to clear that. But Josue was like, well, what if we flip it and raise it up some? And it actually looks a lot better this way than I thought. This header's got a nice clear run. The other header is gonna have to go under, but this header would have to go over. So it's, you know, same thing basically. But it puts that merge, you know, we're way above the subframe. Like we should have no problem keeping the hot side pipes like well above the subframe. So that's not a concern. My next concern with this was the downpipe, because, you know, we got to snake through a tight pocket, but we could even go higher with it and be totally fine. We should have no problem making that turn and getting it turned back. And then once we get past this rack head and that underneath the steering shaft, we've got, I mean, we could run 6-inch through there if we wanted to. The other thing this does is it keeps the compressor housing significantly further away from the rack. With it flipped, it's right up next to the rack, whereas here, we're a good, you know, 2-3 inches away. So I think all in all, this is a better setup. You can see we're not gonna be able to run an air filter. It just is what it is. So there's really no way around that. But yeah, so got it kind of mocked up in here. I'm leaning towards this. My only gripe is that if I had known we were gonna do it like this, if we had thought about this prior to, I would have built this header much lower. But if I built it lower, it'd be harder to get the plugs out. So, you know, it is what it is. But yeah, let's flip it. I'll show you that. We just made a bunch of pie cuts. This is only like a quarter of them because I was expecting to have to use a bunch of pie cuts to get this done. But if we can mount it, if we mount it this way, I don't think we'll need to use any pie cuts to get where we need to go. Honestly, it'd be pretty easy this way. So let's just try it the other way, mock up some pie cuts and see what we think before we go commit in one direction or the other. So we flipped the turbo back around and started running some pie cuts. Now this is absolutely crucial for the short side because it needed to go basically down a little bit and then straight. It's a really awkward run, no way to get a dead straight pipe in there. So we did the pie cuts there, we got it to work, we got from A to B, but it is a short run, but it's feasible. So now it's time to check the other side. Can we get this bend in time? Now you look, with that U-bend, it's a pretty gradual bend, so it's going to take it wide and up by the intake. So I decided let's try some pie cuts on this part as well, just to see what something tight radius might work like. Now, a lot of people hate on pie cuts, but there's a lot of benefits to using pie cuts, and the biggest one and the biggest reason I use them a lot is you can get the tightest radius using pie cuts than you can really get with anything else. So looking at it, it's feasible. I mean, it looks real cool and it looks wild, but this isn't about aesthetics. I want it to look nice, of course, that's just part of it. It's kind of like, your version of art as a fabricator, but it needs to work first and foremost, second, third, fifth, it needs to work. So anyway, looking at this, we don't have room for a wastegate merge here on this short run. We could make one, but with that one, it's not going to work. Now, the long run, pretty solid run. It's got to do that weird loop-to-loop, but it's pretty easy from there to there. It's out of the way of the turbo. It's not terrible. The downpipe, however, is a little tighter than I thought it was going to be. So we looked and we pondered and we thought about it, and I decided, you know what, we really need a perspective change. It's seeing this car up on the quick jacks, it's kind of hard to tell how low, how high everything is and how everything's going to look and fit and where things really are in relationship to the car and the ground. So we decided to throw the coilovers back on it, get this thing back on the ground, put our wheels that we borrowed from the Safiro, the wheels that we got from Fitment Industries. We went ahead and tossed those back on, the Graham lights, which look killer on this car, but they're not for this car. We have to remind ourselves of that. So we got those back on, made this thing a roller, and went ahead and dropped it down on the ground for the first time since the build started on this chassis, which is actually pretty cool. All right, well, check it out. This is what this thing looks like on the ground. It is as much of a perspective change as I imagined it would be. I mean, if you think about it, we haven't had this car on the ground since it was a bare painted carcass. So from there to here, all the stuff we've done in between, this thing has never sat on its own wheels, on its own suspension, under its own weight. And it really, really changes the perspective of where we're going to put the turbo. When the car's up here, everything just seems different. When you build a car on jack stands, quick jacks, a lift, everything looks different when the car is, up at chest level. You really have to put it on the ground before you finalize some major decisions like where we're going to put the turbo. So really excited just to see it on the ground. It looks so good on these Graham lights. I still got to decide what wheels to get for this thing. We still got to get a lot of them, but hey, we got a lot more important things to worry about, like finishing out this turbo kit. So we put this on hold for a few days. We ordered some parts. I ordered all the stuff to build the 4-inch exhaust. Now that stuff is coming in tomorrow, but what I got today was these cast stainless 90s. So we kind of came into a hold up with the turbo placement, and I wanted to get these parts before we committed to one way or the other, because we really need to put the turbo in here sideways if we want to have an air intake to an air filter. If we put it the way I wanted to put it, there's no chance of putting an air filter on it. And that might be fine on a drag car or something like that, but you got to think, this being a drift car and a competitive drift car at that, we are following people just pouring tire smoke, chunks of rubber. I mean, you see what sticks to the inside of the fenders. That's a lot for a turbo slash an engine to eat, not to mention rocks and gravel and stuff. We pretty much have to run an air filter, so we really have to put the turbo sideways. Now the complication with that is, one, getting out of this header and up in a way that stays away from the intake of the turbo. That's a big thing. Thing two is putting the turbo far enough that way to have a 4-inch downpipe 90 and go through this pocket. The bigger diameter of the tube, the more gradual the bend, more or less. The wider the centerline radius. So it's a fight. If we could just shove the turbo this way, this would be no problem. If we could just shove the turbo all the way over here, this would be no problem. But since we have things to deal with on both sides, it's really important that we get it in the right spot. So I ordered these stainless cast 90s. Now the reason for these is they're super tight bend radius. Like this 4-inch is a 4-inch bend radius, which means it makes a very tight corner. Now the problem is, I'm not even really sure what these are supposed to be used for, but they're not measured in the same size as stainless exhaust piping. So the 4-inch ones are actually like 4.5 inches. This is a 5-inch inlet, and you can see it's almost big enough for that. So this is 4-inch stainless. And the 2.5-inch, we have the same problem. This is bigger than 2.5-inch, and this is still way bigger than that. So unfortunately, these aren't gonna work. My plan was to use these for here and in the turbo and just have to connect the dots. Now, there are some other options that we could use. I've tinkered with cutting 90s out of our U-bends, but these are a pretty wide, nice, smooth flowing radius. We need a bit tighter radius than this. Since those aren't gonna work, we gotta determine another option. I think as much as I tried to avoid it, we're just gonna have to use pie cuts. I didn't wanna use pie cuts on a hot side like this, but I don't think we have another choice at the moment. I really don't. As you can see, this is a super tight radius, and that's the big benefit to pie cuts. You get pretty much as tight of a radius as you're gonna get out of a given material diameter. So we're gonna mock it up with some pie cuts. Again, I really didn't wanna do this. I was trying to avoid it, but the one nice thing about pie cuts, and the reason I like to use them, is you can get that fitment 100%. You can twist and curve and spiral your way through any combination of obstructions and get to where you need to go with as much clearance as physically possible. So yeah, that was a whole lot of jibber jabber to say. We need to get this turbo placed back in here where we want it, mock up some pie cuts on that, and go from there. Let's get to it. So we went ahead and tacked this first section of pie cuts together. I've been doing this a little more lately, just kind of tacking as we go. It's easier than trying to hold everything together with tape, because you might think everything's good and you're getting towards the end and then it all falls apart and you got to start over. So we know that the first bend coming out, the first few pie cuts, needs to be a constant radius. So we got those tacked together, went ahead and pulled the V-band off and tacked them to the V-band. This is the nice thing about using V-bands, is they can be used in any orientation. So you can rotate it however you need. You don't have to figure it out prior to tacking it. Now, we were going to use flex joints here, and these are going to do two things: allow everything to flex and allow some misalignment. But there wasn't enough room to fit it and get all the bends we need. That's why we need to use pie cuts, is to get, we've got a complex amount of bends to get from A to B on this, and the flex joint just didn't offer enough room. We tried it a bunch of different ways, more pie cuts before, more after, and we just could not make it work. So we had to carry on our plan without flex joints. So we used part of a bend, couple more pie cuts, figured out a straight section, cut off what we didn't need at the bend. That's the nice thing about this merge, is the inside diameter is 2.5 inch. So the pipe fits in there. So it gives you some misalignment. You can move stuff around and you can just kind of shove it in there. So we did that. We cut it off so it wasn't overly sticking in there and dividing up the housing. Got our marks done and went ahead and pulled everything off to tack it on the bench. Now, I'm a big proponent of tacking things in the car because you're guaranteed it's going to fit and it's going to be where it was. But stuff like this, if you want to get really good fit up and tight gaps, it's easier to tack it on the bench because you can tape it up and hold it in place and even out the gap if you do have a little bit of one to deal with, and make sure everything's good and you're not going to have a huge gap on one side. Because when you tack it in the car, sometimes you'll think you're good and you won't have a gap on the top, but then you'll have an 1/8 inch gap on the bottom. So we marked it, we pulled it out, we tacked the whole thing together, and then we get to try it back in. Alright, I'm happy with that. Nice short run. Keeps us pretty good and far away from the turbo. Got room for the inlet. It's definitely one of those situations where pie cuts are almost absolutely necessary. The shorter the run you have, the less distance you have to make your bends and corrections. So really the harder it is to get it to fit just right. So far so good. Oh, it's pretty sick. Nice job. So the next side was a bit simpler. We really didn't need to use pie cuts on this side, but it would kind of kill my OCD to not have pie cuts on one side but have them on the other. So we cut our main bend and our main straight section and then mocked it up with a stack of pie cuts, which had to go mostly one direction, a little bit the other. We got our straight cut down to size, cleaned up the outside on the belt grinder, the inside with the tie grinder, blew it out, put everything back in place, and made sure that our pie cut situation was going to work. Now, we ended up cutting the bend a little short. It's kind of hard to mock this stuff up and get it just right when you're laying it over top of each other. So we cut a short little fill piece to go in there and then went ahead and tacked up what we had as far as pie cuts because we knew for sure it was going to work. It was going to get us where we needed to go. It basically needed to curve in for a while and then straighten back out basically behind the header. So we line everything up, we're getting ready to tack it, and this extra piece was just bothering me. It was just a straight piece off a straight piece. There was no need for that. So I decided to sacrifice another U-bend, cut it, and we know now we have that to mock up and jig off of to cut the length long enough to where we can eliminate that second piece, eliminate some of the welds, even though we're using pie cuts. So it's not like eliminating welds is going to help us all that much. But hey, make it less pieces, make it a little cleaner. So go through the same process, grind it down, grind the inside, get it all back in place, and it all fits really nice. So this one, we decided to tack it in the car just because where it was in the V-band and where it was attached to the other pipe, all of that was really important and was going to be hard to mimic outside of the car. So this is definitely one of those situations where we had to tack it in the car if we wanted it to fit back right when we went to reinstall it. So threw a few more tacks on it, checked it again, and everything works. It's the completed pipes, man. That went super quick once we committed to one direction or the other, like piece of cake. I mean, I still got to weld it and weld it to the merge, and we got to cut giant holes and put the wastegate merges on, but I'm pretty happy with that. They're very similar length. I'd almost be willing to bet they're within an inch or so of overall pipe length of each other, even though the headers are in very different spots and the turbo's still center. We'll have to really dial that in. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull them out, weld them by themselves just in case they move any. That way we still have that bit of misalignment in here to get everything in, get it centered, then tack it here, then weld it here. It'll also make it way easier to weld out all these pie cuts with the two short pieces instead of this whole Y bullhorn contraption deal. But dang, dude, that does look sick. So pie cuts are all fine and dandy. They're really easy to work with, almost really easier than working with a bunch of mandrel bends until you gotta weld them. And then you realize, man, this is a lot of welding. It's gonna take me longer to weld it than it did to come up with the design, mock it up, tack it together. It takes a while, and even this being only 2.5 inch pipe, so 7.5 inches, a little over 8 inches around, it's a lot of welding. So we're back purging it. This is definitely important on this because it's on the hot side and because we're going to have so many welds. If we had a bunch of stalagmites, as they call it in there, it's going to interrupt the flow into the turbo, which we do not want. So pie cuts are definitely a controversial topic. I think a lot of people see them as a purely aesthetic thing, which at times they definitely are, and they have gotten a little bit played out. I'll be honest. I like them, and I've definitely gotten a little sick of them. But the thing with pie cuts is it's not just about getting a tighter bend radius or the aesthetics. It's the fact that you can change direction every inch. So if you're trying to snake through some really elaborate set of corners to get something from A to B, you can change that direction every inch. You can go down for 2-3 pieces, and then to the right for 2 pieces, and then to the left for 1 piece, and then back to the right, and it makes it really easy to jog around. Not only that, but the only way to get a lot of this stuff to fit and work without pie cuts would be to have multiple different bend radius material and be able to choose from each one. Now, if you already knew what you were doing and where everything was going, that would be easy. But if you don't already have that, it's not really feasible to order a bunch of different bends in a bunch of different bend radiuses. But anyway, we got this all welded up. We got it back in, and boy, I'm pretty happy with how this looks. For all the debate and whatever, it came out nice. All right, we got both sides in. Really happy with how this turned out. Everything fit back together nicely. I like it. I think it looks sweet. Now, I want it to look cool, but this thing has to work, right? So that's only part of it, but I'm definitely happy with how it looks. So this is a SEMA build or something, man, A1, I'm good with it. But Functionality, yet to be seen. But all in all, I'm very happy with the packaging we have with this orientation. For what we're working with, I definitely think this was the best solution. Really short runs, we got good distance to everything. I'm really happy with it. So I was gonna go ahead, tack these into the merge, weld as much of it in the car as I could before we took it out, because we can't afford for it to flex any with no flex joints. Since we have no flex joints, we have no flex. So if it moves even a degree or two down here at the V-band, it's not really gonna line back up unless we kind of pry the stainless and, you know, bend it and warp it. So basically this has to be perfect. Now, because of that, ideally, we'd have a little flex. So we started looking and we found some shorter flex joints. The ones we have are 4.5 inch. We found some 2.5 inch, which should fit, just barely fit in here. So we're gonna wait on welding into the merge, because if we have that misalignment there at the merge, it'll make it easier to get all this lined up, because we're gonna have to cut apart all this that I just welded, fit the flex joint in here, and then weld it all back up. So we're gonna wait on welding into the merge. That'll just make that whole process a lot easier. But I'm really glad we found those, because that'll make this not so critical, you know, and it'll give us some flexibility to where everything can kind of move around a little bit, and hopefully we're not cracking the welds. Anyway, I'm jibber jabbering. Point is, since we're not working on that, we're gonna start working on the wastegate merge. Now, I've got these really cool high flow cast stainless Motion Raceworks wastegate merges. The problem is with how weird this pipe bends, they're not really designed to fit here, and where we have to put it so we still have room for the flex joint, because we could put it here and it would be great, but that's the only place the flex joint can go. We really need to put this thing like here in this really awkward position. So unfortunately, or I don't think we're going to be able to use these. Like, see, it's beautifully designed for stuff like this, but very tight, very short runs. We could put it here, but we can't put it there. So what we're going to do, instead of hacking these up, I'm going to save these for the no prep car build. That is inevitable. And we're going to make our own out of some 2-inch Mishimoto stainless pipe. So this way we can really try to dial in the fitment and get the wastegate wherever we need it. We won't have as much flow as these. That's why they're called high flow. Look how big that opening is. We want as much priority to the wastegate as possible, but compromise. We gotta take what we can get. So let's see what we can come up with chopping some of this up. So we went ahead and started cutting our U-bend here. So we cut a little piece off so that way we can get it in there and get a 45 on it. Now we're gonna cut this longer than we need to for 2 reasons. Reason number one, it's the only way to hold it in the cold cut saw. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to hold such a small piece. The other reason is it's gonna be easier for us to handle and cope it on the belt grinder if it's a little longer. So we start coping it, try to get it to fit real nice. Once we've got it close, we go ahead and weld it to the wastegate flange. Now the reason for welding it to the wastegate flange before we weld it to the actual hot side pipe is because it's gonna be a lot easier to weld all the way around this flange, and we're able to clamp it to the wastegate just like we clamped the merge into the turbo to try to prevent it from warping. We need a good tight seal here. So the welds came out pretty nice. We had good gas coverage, pretty consistent color. There's a couple spots where we didn't have as much gas coverage. It basically, if you have the right amount of gas coverage, you don't have a lot of discoloration, but you can see how well the back purging worked. Those 2 spots that you do see are from the tacks, which obviously weren't back purging when we tacked it. It makes a world of difference. There's literally nothing on the inside. So we mocked the wastegate up in here. Now the crucial thing here is we need to keep this wastegate high enough for us to be able to run a 5-inch intake out of the engine bay. So we're pretty limited on where we can put it. So we find the spot, we mark it, we go ahead and shove this pipe inside the pipe to kind of catch all the slag from the plasma cutter. Plasma cutter is not the cleanest cutting method, but it works really well when you're cutting out an awkward shape like this. So we got it cut out. We go back with the carbide burr and clean all the edges up. You're not getting a perfectly straight cut with the plasma cutter. So a carbide burr is pretty much crucial. Plus you can kind of sneak up on it and check it versus accidentally cutting too much and then you wasted the whole pipe. So we get this thing taped up. We get it tacked in here. We set up our back purge setup. Another important back purge moment. This is a new thing for me. I used to never back purge, but on a hot side, it's critical. It's not even about whether you want to or not. You pretty much have to. So we start welding this thing out. It's a little tricky to get into the tight corner up at the front, but getting to the rest of it is honestly pretty easy. Easier than I had imagined. It honestly welded out really nice. It was It took a little more coping and a little more coaxing, but we got it to fit really good. We got it welded up. It all fit nice, no big gaps, nice tight weld, so it shouldn't fall off. We might have to come back and brace it, but we got it all done. We got the pipe back in, we got the wastegate on, and it looks pretty snazzy in there. We got room still for the intake. Everything turned out like I had hoped, and we got decent wastegate priority. It's not as good as I would like, but it's about as good as it's going to get. So then we start working on the other one. Now this one we're going to be able to get much better wastegate priority, and it's a bit easier to fit up. We're not in a compound bin, we're just on the outside of a bin. So we start coping it on the Ameribray belt grinder, just cope, check, cope, check. It's a lot of back and forth to get it right. If you grind too much here, then it doesn't fit there. It's tricky to get it right, but we got to where we were happy with it. We went ahead, did the same thing, welded the flange to it with it attached to the gate, so that way it couldn't warp. Put it back in place to check where we wanted to cut the pipe. This is critical. We can't undo this. We get one shot at this. So we check it again with the wastegate itself, make sure that it's going to fit. It's not going to hit the hood. We're going to have clearance for all these other things we need to put in there. And then we're ready. We go ahead, we commit, we cut it out. We do the same thing. We shove a catch pipe in there to catch a lot of that slag so we have less cleanup on the inside afterwards. Once it's cut out, we clean it up again with the carbide burr. We tack it in again. It's obviously the same process over. And again, this one was a little bit easier to deal with just because it was a much simpler bin to work around. Now, doing it on top of the pie cuts was a little tricky because the physical weld from the pie cuts would kind of get in the way, and you almost had to cope around the beads that were already on the pie cut. But other than that, it was a pretty straightforward process to weld this out. These were really fun to weld, more fun than I was expecting. It's just a nice little pocket to weld into. Everything's got its nuances when it comes to welding, and some's easy, some's not. It's some stuff's way easier to make look nice, and this is one of those things that was pretty easy to make look nice. So we tossed it back in, tossed the wastegate back on, and bada bing, bada boom. Our hot side is done. It's got wastegates, it's got hot pipes. There's still some more to do, but we've got it figured out. We went from A to B and got C in there, the wastegate. All right, both wastegates are mounted. Really happy with how that came out. I would love for them to be symmetrical, and I thought of ways to do it, but there really was no way to make them perfectly symmetrical. But we should be able to have the dump tubes pretty close to symmetrical, because this one will curve out and up, and then this one will go pretty much straight up, or we can angle it and have it curve out and up. We'll try to get them pretty close to even. It's gonna bug me if the holes in the hood are different, but we gotta do what we gotta do. One of those things, just part of it with the way we had to build the headers to go under the alternator and so on and so forth. But really happy with the wastegate placement. They've both got really good wastegate priority. You know, if the exhaust is rushing through here, it's easier for it to go straight and out the wastegate than it is for it to make the turn and go that way. And that is crucial. That is super important. I learned that with the turbo truck. I'd heard people talk about it and the wastegate placement's not gonna work, and I didn't believe it till I saw it. I like to try things for myself, and 100% I understand now. So from then on, very picky about wastegate priority, because it matters, especially on a V8. Maybe like a 4-cylinder or 2 liter or something, it wouldn't be that important. But with a big V8, there's a lot of exhaust flow. You've got to be able to evacuate it correctly. So that's why the turbo truck now has a second wastegate. So anyway, I wish we could finish this up and call it done and dusted, but I'm still waiting on those flex joints. I had to order them on eBay. Those are the only ones I could find that were short enough. So we got to wait for those to get here, chop this up, weld those in, then we can weld it into the merge, because again, I don't want to do that just yet. It'll be easier to get everything well lined up without this being welded yet. And then once that's done, the turbo location is fixed, and we can start working on the downpipe and the exhaust and the cold side. We should have most everything we need to do both of those. So we're getting there. Turbo kit is coming along. I'm really happy with how this turned out. Heat management is going to be important. You know, we're going to have to really just heat shield any and everything, but that's kind of part of it with the Turbo LS. So curious to see how this pans out. Excited to do more fab projects. That's probably one of the big reasons I decided to do the Turbo, is just because I was excited to do the fab projects. They're fun. It's definitely been as fun as I thought it would be. So anyway, I'm gonna quit jibber jabbering. I'm gonna let you guys go. Hope to see you next time. More turbo stuff, most likely. So hope to see you guys for that. But for now, that's it. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. Goodbye.